Thank you all for being here today. I will hand the proverbial mic over to Director Daphne Rand.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining the State Department and the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center for our formal launch of the State Department's Learning Agenda. We are so excited to talk about it today. I want to give you a bit of information about it and really invite your participation. This Learning Agenda originated with the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act of 2018, which, when it passed in 2019, went to OMB and to the White House, which then directed every agency to create a learning agenda, which is basically a plan to answer a set of policy relevant questions that are critical for our agency's objectives. The Department of State has always seen learning as important and has seized on this learning agenda and OMB and the White House's enthusiasm for it as a direct way to modernize the State Department and enhance US foreign policy. To develop this learning agenda over the past year and a half, almost 2 years, near over 100 State Department employees across almost every bureau here at the State Department have met in groups and have planned and created the document that we're launching today, honing in on what are the core objectives and goals of the State Department and what do we want to learn and know about them. And we are so proud and grateful to the energy that's come really from the bottom up across the State Department for this project. And I'm honored to be joined by Director Douglas Picken from the Office of Budget and Planning BP that has been the partner with the Office of Foreign Assistance in encouraging this excitement and energy. Today is the launch of this, and we're starting this for 4 years. These groups will meet and pursue the activities in this learning agenda that's been publicly launched. And we will develop these 8 questions across the groups, and we will try to document our learning in line with the bill and in line with congressional expectations and this administration's firm belief and evidence. So although this was a mandatory exercise that OMB instructed us, almost 2 years in, the State Department has really risen to the occasion, understanding that updating our institution will require evidence and learning. Trying to figure out what we know about what works and how we can study our issues that we work on is critical to our success. We want to make sure that we improve the way we give Americans passports, improve the way we address human trafficking around the world, and improve the way we have efficacious and important and impactful educational exchange programs, just to take a few examples from this learning agenda. Now, I should just end by saying we've had many secretaries of state who have cared passionately about learning and the power of data, but our current secretary is seized on this issue. He is passionate about turning data and analysis into innovation and change. And I will just quote from the secretary's modernization agenda, which he launched in October of 2021, where he said, "The department has vast and diverse data sets, but we haven't done a good enough job making data available to you in a timely and useful way to help you make missions or management decisions more effectively. We're changing that. We also haven't always done a good job capturing lessons from our work. A learning institution is a strong institution, open to new insights, new information, new ways of working." And the secretary today, many months later, is as committed to these principles as he was in October. So we are so honored to have our Undersecretary, Toria Nuland, here to give a few thoughts and remarks to launch this event. I need not introduce her long and extensive biography, and I will just note a few points. For 33 years, Undersecretary Nuland served as a US diplomat, including being an Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs from September 2013 to 2017. She was a State Department spokesperson when I first met her, fearlessly going out during a time of incredible global change under Secretary Hillary Clinton's tenure, and was a US ambassador to NATO during President George Bush's second term. Undersecretary Nuland has worked for presidents of both parties and is a strong bipartisan voice for foreign policy and most importantly for diplomacy. Across the State Department, Undersecretary Nuland is beloved not only for her brilliance and her ability to turn diplomacy into action, but for the care that she gives to each of us who work here and the real commitment to this institution, which we all also share our love for. So with that, we've asked Undersecretary Nuland to launch us off in a spirit of learning. There's no better person who embodies both the character and the integrity of the US State Department, Ambassador Toria Nuland. Great.
Well, thanks, Daphne. Now I have to live up to that. Hello, State Department colleagues. Hello, Belfer. Hello, participants in this Learning Agenda launch. We are enormously grateful to have so much interest in this program, to have so much participation across the State Department. And now, as Daphne said, we are hoping that the Kennedy School in Belfer in particular will join us in partnership in some of this work. So let me just jump into it here. I think the question is, diplomacy is this fuzzy thing, right? How do you actually measure whether you've made any difference with these hours and hours of jaw that we do? We're always trying to prevent a war, but did the talking actually lead to that? Would the war have been, we still end up with conflict, we still end up with poverty, we still end up with American security and prosperity challenged around the world. We still end up with COVID and health challenges. So the question becomes, can you take this art of diplomacy, it is not a science, and put more rigor into how we evaluate what we've done in the past, how those lessons might apply in the future, whether we're getting value for money from the American people, whether we're getting value for people from the American people. When we ask for the president's time in doing what he's been doing the last few days out at the G7 in Germany and at the NATO summit, is that actually translating into greater security, prosperity, unity, et cetera? How do you measure all of those things? So that's what this is about. Trying to better understand when we're successful and when we're not successful, and learn for that for the next time. So it's a particularly key that we are sure that the investments we're making in people, in diplomatic time, investments of money, are leading to better security outcomes, better prosperity outcomes, better delivery for the American people in the tactical things like consular services, but more broadly in their ability to be broad participants in the in global trade, to create jobs, to feel secure, to have allies when we face challenges around the world, to tackle things like COVID multilaterally, since we know that COVID, climate, et cetera, none of these we can do alone. So how do we measure some of those things? So as you know, we have these 8 questions we've put to ourselves, which really speak to the categories of work that we do here. Just to give you a couple of examples. Question 1, how can the department improve the effectiveness of its diplomatic interventions to better advance foreign policy objectives? Oh my God, my head's exploding. How do you measure that at all? That's a really broad category, and Ambassador Bodine's going to tell you probably later, sorry Barbara, that it's impossible, and she may be right, but we're going to try. We're going to try to do better at that. There are some things that are far more concrete. Can we measure our customer service in the consular arena? That we ought to be able to do. But let me give you a couple, 3, 4 examples from my experience where I've either benefited from learning or been frustrated when we didn't do enough learning. And this is less in the quantifiable places of diplomacy and more in those kind of fuzzy parts of diplomacy. So I'm an old dog. My first big conflict and stabilization effort was the Balkans in the 90s. So first Bosnia and then the Kosovo War, bringing those wars to an end through diplomacy, through multilateral work, and then putting in multilateral stabilization forces to try to help those countries develop indigenous strength to govern better, to manage their budgets better, to deliver for people better. In both cases, we still have some international entities there. So, we did all that. It was actually at that time, the first time that we had done it at that level of international engagement, at that level of commitment of US government effort. That was in the Clinton years, since Vietnam. And so we tried to learn some lessons from Vietnam, but it was, a very, very different time. But very quickly then thereafter, within 6 years, we were into Afghanistan after September 11th, 2001. And once again, we were trying to launch a stabilization effort. And I was very frustrated at that time that I thought we had learned some lessons in terms of how we work with international, how we work with other countries, how we harness the power of UN agencies, everybody from UNHCR to UNICEF, et cetera, to special representatives of the Secretary General, how we harness the international financial institutions, the IFIs, the World Bank. We had learned some of those lessons in Kosovo in a democratic administration. And I watched the George Bush 43 administration reteach itself a lot of those lessons. And we were slower and less impactful, at least at the beginning and over time, than we might have been. And then 2003-04, we're into Iraq. And amazingly, the same team was not able to transfer some of those Afghanistan lessons over to Iraq, and we reinvented the wheel again. So that's what we want to avoid doing. We want to sort of catalog, evaluate, bank the learning that we're doing so that we do better next time. Now, you can't always compare apples and oranges. You can't always compare different conflicts, but we can do better on those kinds of things. Let me give you another example that I think has been better, but we never did a formal catalog of this one. It's just sort of the institutional memory of various individuals. So as some of you know, I, Secretary Blinken, the president, Jake Sullivan, all were involved when Russia invaded Ukraine the first time in 2014. And some things went well in that context, some things didn't go well. This time, when we began to see the Russian planning in October, November, there were a number of things that we were committed to doing differently that we felt hadn't gone well enough the first time. So certain things like we had never been able in the first conflict to use the intelligence we were getting for diplomatic purposes. So to be able to declassify intelligence so that we could go public with what we were seeing, so that we could get our allies and partners together, so that we could work with the Ukrainians. That worked better this time because we were very insistent on doing better. And that came from the top. It came from the president, from Jake, from Secretary of State, et cetera. And from Bill Burns, obviously, who was a key diplomat who during that time. A second thing that we understood from that conflict was that we needed to get better weapons onto the field faster. Have we done as much of that as I would like in this conflict? No, but I think we're doing better and we've done it faster. And then the last one is, the whole question of how you support Ukraine financially through this. And obviously they need money for weapons, they need money for, all of the economic needs on the ground, et cetera. But what we found was in the middle of a conflict, the public coffers, the tax base, et cetera, really shrink. And so you need to provide budget support as well. And that was something that we planned. We worked with partners, we got multilateral support, we got IFI support on the front end. So to the extent we're doing somewhat better this time in supporting the Ukrainians, it is a result of the fact that so many of the humans learned a bunch and didn't think we did well enough the first time. But there's a whole lot more learning that'll come out of this one that we need to quantify more systematically, and we need help with that. Last example I'll give you is the Kenya elections example. We had terrible elections, lots of violence in Kenya in 2007-08. The interventions that we had made with democracy funding, with economic funding did not help. So we made a concerted effort when Linda Thomas Greenfield was Assistant Secretary to do better in the 2013 elections in terms of providing the kind of support, both electoral and democratic support, but also security support, public diplomacy support, those kinds of things to have a better election in 2013. And now we're applying those again for the August elections this year. So that's what this is about. We want you to be excited about this. We don't want this just to be the State Department grading its own homework. We want to open our doors and get scholars and students and others who might be interested in helping us think about this, to apply data learning, to apply modern techniques that are used in science and other quantifiable fields to what we do. So that's what this is about, inviting you to join us, inviting you to get excited about it. Thank you very much for joining us today. Okay.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Undersecretary Nuland for those great remarks. We're now going to start a panel discussion with three very esteemed colleagues to talk about our learning agenda and to talk about some of the themes that the Undersecretary has raised. So we're very pleased to have three panelists that we've invited to bring different perspectives to this conversation. I'm going to introduce all three, and then we're going to have 3 rounds of questions for each. And then we are going to invite participation from our vast audience here. So thank you again. Now let me introduce our Ambassador Barbara Bodine. She is well known to us at the State Department for her incredible distinguished service. She is currently the Distinguished Professor in Practice of Diplomacy and the Director of the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy at Georgetown University, and has taught and directed policy task force on U.S. diplomacy focused on the Persian Gulf, in Yemen and Iraq for many years, including at Princeton University before Georgetown. Over the course of 30 years in the Foreign Service, Ambassador Bodine's focus was on the Arabian Peninsula and the greater Persian Gulf area, and focused particularly on U.S. bilateral and regional policy, including strategic security issues, counterterrorism, and governance and reform. She is known among the State Department for her leadership in Yemen as the ambassador from 1997 to 2001 that saw a period of enhanced support for democratization and increased security and counterterrorism cooperation after the bombing of USS Cole. Ambassador Bodine also served in Baghdad during a very important, difficult time of the Iran-Iraq War, and as Deputy Chief of Mission again during the Iraqi invasion and occupation of 1990 and 91. And has worked in the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs a couple of times as well. So Ambassador Bodine is really so well regarded in the halls of this building. We cannot thank you enough for joining us. Currently, Ambassador Bodine is running the Institute of Study of Diplomacy and really has become the intellectual hub for our Foreign Service. When our diplomats need a break, they go there to teach. When we want to recruit folks, we look to the Institute of Study of Diplomacy. And most importantly, the next generation of diplomats are being trained every day by Ambassador Bodine. So thank you for joining us today. We have from the U.S. Institute of Peace, Mr. David Connolly, who directs the Learning, Evaluation, and Research program there. Mr. Connolly brings a more international perspective to this discussion and joined USAP in May 2018 after experience with universities and think tanks in Amsterdam, Belfast, The Hague, and York, and his experience, very importantly, working with several other governments, including the governments of Afghanistan, the Netherlands, and UK, a number of multilateral agencies, the UN and World Bank in particular, INGOs, the private sector, and various research associations and councils. Dr. Connolly has worked at the intersection of research and policy on conflict-affected states, and it's focused on really how to study local governance and more broadly the role of evidence in conflict prevention. And he has professionally focused and has experience on 16 conflict-affected states across South and Southeast Asia, East and West Africa, and the Middle East. So thank you, Dr. Connolly, for joining us from USIP and bringing all those perspectives. And last but certainly not least is our friend Eric Rosenbach, who I briefly was able to intersect with when he was a professional staff member on the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, who is co-director of the Belfer Center and Harvard Kennedy School, and really a leader. Eric, you have trained and mentored so many people who've come into the State Department that we're so grateful to you because your legacy really lives on as a leader, a mentor, a thought leader for the next generation of State Department employees. You currently also head the center's Defending Digital Democracy project and worked as the Chief of Staff to Secretary of Defense Ash Carter from 2015 to 2017. So Eric, you have experience leading big organizations, which is part of this project, and you are a senior most leader of an organization with 2.8 million personnel and a 585 billion annual budget. That budget has gone up significantly since you were chief of staff. I will just note, and you manage the department's most sensitive issues, ensuring implementation of transformational change on technology, budget, and talent management. So we have asked you to speak in part because of your change leadership experience, your change management experience on our sister organization here, DoD, with whom we work so closely. The State Department DoD collaboration is critical, especially in the field, but certainly also in Washington. Mr. Rosenbach has authored so many books and contributes so much articles, but we are so thrilled to have you here in your capacity at the Belfer Center and your leadership in Washington and the policy circles. So those are our three esteemed panelists. We're going to ask each of them a round of questions. And the first one is to get your perspectives on the State Department's efficacy and impact. That's at the heart of this project of the learning agenda. We want the State Department to be more efficacious and more impactful and to achieve its goals. So we'll start with you, Ambassador Bodine. Why is the State Department sometimes averse to learning and studying diplomatic success and failures? Why is it hard for the State Department? And maybe it's easier to study particular multilateral diplomacy or public diplomacy than the straight up old-fashioned bilateral diplomatic work that we do. So please share your views with us on that.
2 years into COVID and I still forget to unmute. One of the nice things about being retired state is that somebody asked me my views, I can actually give them to you. I don't think the State Department is adverse to learning at all. And I think, Toria's comment that, when you brought back, when you reassembled the band from the 2014 Russian invasion of Ukraine for 2022, they were able to bring a lot of lessons and apply them. I think there is a problem with being somewhat ahistorical, and that's not a problem of the State Department. That's one of the charms of Americans, is that to us, history is something that happened 3 weeks ago, and something that happened 10 years ago is almost seen as irrelevant. We're not adverse to learning. We often don't have the opportunity, and we often don't have the time. We are moving so quickly that we don't have the time to go back. I would also want to underscore Toria's comment that one of the problems that we have is that diplomacy is fuzzy. It's one thing to be able to do customer service on consular or, management sections that actually work at embassies abroad. But when you get to diplomacy, it's almost impossible to quantify what we do. And in fact, I think that there's a great danger in trying to quantify it. Diplomacy is a process. It's not an event. It doesn't have an immediate deliverable. There may be at a conference, as we just had with NATO, deliverable, Turkey agrees to Finland and Sweden joining. But if you look at a major step forward like that as an event, and you just go back 2 or 3 steps as to how we did it, you're losing what diplomacy is about. And you end up trying to do short-term intervention to change trajectories rather than being engaged long-term. And I think one example of this would be when China and the Solomon Islands were about to sign a deal. At least according to the press, the US government freaked out and started sending people like crazy all over the South Pacific to say, no, China bad, China bad. That's not diplomacy. That may be crisis management, but it's not diplomacy. Diplomacy is the art, the fuzzy art, the non-quantifiable art of building relationships for issues you do not yet know you're going to have, and being able to then have those conversations in a way that people are listening and you are listening as well. We shouldn't have been surprised by the Solomon Island China agreement. We should have been in there before. And so to the extent that we think diplomacy are these big ticket events, and we then try to quantify the short-term steps that either made it happen or kept it from happening, we're not really understanding what diplomacy is. I think having, a congressional act that says we should have evidence-based policy is wonderful, and sort of terrifying that we actually have to have a congressional act to say that we are evidence-based. The opposite of evidence-based is ignorance-based, and I can't think of a circumstance where that is actually a better way to do things. But I think, and again, on the diplomacy side, the fuzzy side, the art side, that data supports, data informs, but we can't let data become a substitute or a crutch. Diplomacy takes not just an understanding of the issue or the data, but a knowledge and an understanding, experience, as evidenced in Toria's case about Ukraine, which comes together to something kind of a nice old-fashioned word called wisdom. And that's the ability to intuitively understand where the other side is coming from and why, and therefore being able to work with them, Turkey. Okay, what are they really after? What is their real issue? And how do we deal with this? That takes more than just a 1 month understanding of the current crisis. A lot of this comes from, we do need to capture it. And I will put in a plug for the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy. We have 260 diplomacy-based case studies, which we make available to students and professors everywhere, where you can delve into specific issues and get some of the background and then what the decision tree was. But we need to understand that this is a long-term investment. Now, one of the things that the State Department has continuously beat itself up on is our on-the-job training, that we don't do the kinds of schools that the military does. Ergo, we're not educated, therefore we're not trained. Every profession has a strong component of on-the-job training. You don't come out of medical school and go straight into being a doctor. You shadow a doctor, lawyers, your electrician. Everybody does on-the-job training. And given the fluidity of diplomacy, the only way I think you can actually learn the job is by watching those who have done it well and before, or going back and studying diplomatic history and seeing how it was done. Diplomatic history has become a lost art in the academic world. And so to a certain extent, our inability to learn from diplomatic history reflects a shift in academia, which is where we all come out of, that has tried to quantify political science, has tried to quantify international relations, and has lost the qualitative element of it. And so, yes, we should be evidence-based. Yes, we should have data. Yes, we need to understand the issues. But we need to understand that we have to be on the qualitative side, the long-term side. And when we're looking for metrics, metrics are going to be long-term and very hard to quantify, almost impossible to quantify. And if we try to push things into metrics, 1-year metrics, 5-year metrics, or even 10-year metrics, we're going to frustrate ourselves and we're going to get into short-term programs that don't have a long-term impact. And one example I have, one of my favorites is you don't know when you drop pebbles, be it foreign assistance or anything else, you don't know where that's going to go. And one of my last acts in Yemen was to get a Fulbright program reinstated. And 35% of the students were women. 10 or 15 years later, I was back in Yemen and I was at a social event. And a gentleman came up and said, I hope you don't mind, but I brought my wife. And I said, of course I don't. And she came up and said, you don't remember me. Don't ever say that to somebody. It puts them in a horrible position. I had given her a Fulbright, one of the first Fulbrights, and she had come to the States and gotten a master's in social work, come back to Yemen, and opened the first women's shelter in Sana'a and Aden. I don't know what kind of an impact that scholarship had. It is too broad and it is going to go on for too long. So how would you measure, was that a valid scholarship or not? So I think I really want to pull us back to art. I want to pull us back to fuzzy. I want to pull us back to qualified analysis as opposed to defaulting to quantified, which I think will distort us and make us less intuitive, less relationship, less wise going forward. I can continue, but I would like to hear from my other panelists.
Dr. Rand, I think you're muted.
You're muted.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Thanks, Ambassador Bodine. We want to thank you so much for those words, and we'll get back to you in a second. But for now, we want to turn to Eric. Can you take us for the perspective of the rest of the national security establishment, including DoD and the IC, the intelligence community? How much do those institutions depend on the State Department's diplomatic success and impact? And what would you like to see from that perspective in terms of the improvements in State Department's capacities, particularly in the cyber domain and in our great power competition?
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Rand. Very nice to see you again. Ambassador Bodine, Dr. Connolly. I also just wanted to thank all the participants who are out there, almost all of you public servants in state and otherwise, what you're doing. It's really important. The Belfer Center is so happy and excited about this initiative and to be able to partner with you all. You know, it's why we're here, and so many people from the Belfer Center there in the State Department right now doing hard work, whether they've been Pickering or Rangel Fellows, or they're Wendy Sherman as the Deputy Secretary of State, Ambassador Powers, many others. So I'd like to make just 3 quick points. I think in general, and then to answer the very specific question, we'll do it very quickly. First, I think it's really interesting when you talk about whether or not there's time to learn and look at the past. And I think one of the things that we should focus on over the course of this initiative is how to help create an organizational culture where you make time, and time is expected to be made by senior leaders to do learning. The Department of Defense has a lot of shortfalls, and the military has a lot of things wrong with it too. But one thing that is important is there's a long tradition of lessons learned at the end of any major operation, or even when you're going through things. It can be very flawed in the way that you can write a 700-page volume on lessons learned in Iraq and repeat almost all of the same mistakes. But an organizational culture that tries to do that, I think, is effective in some ways. I think the second that I'd like to just talk about is, I think execution of policy is probably one of the weakest areas across the government as a whole. There are a lot of very good policymakers who actually will consider a lot of evidence and data and use frameworks and think about the national interest, all those things you learn at Georgetown and that we teach here at the Kennedy School. But I think a weakness is in executing. And too often when we're trying to learn, we focus too much on the sexy kind of policy issues of what we may or may have done well, and not on how we could have executed a good idea better in order to carry it forward. To answer the direct question that you had, Daphne, to me, when I was Assistant Secretary of Defense, I was involved with the negotiations with China on the cyber theft of intellectual property, and always had my State Department colleague at the time, Chris Painter, as a really important partner. And you do not want the Department of Defense as the lead negotiator on an issue like that. It already skews the negotiations with the Chinese. Just having an effective State Department defense relationship shows them that we're working on things like this together. And it's much too often the case, unfortunately, that people in the Department of Defense and the uniformed military take the lead on things that are actually State Department type missions. You could look at many COCOM commanders, for example, that play a role that definitely should be someone from the State Department. I know I don't need to explain this to Ambassador Bodine for the time she spent in CENTCOM. So I think that's why it's important for state to continue to grow, have more people who can execute, are willing to fill that leadership role that comes from learning, and essentially gaining more competency and engendering more confidence, quite frankly, sometimes with others in the international community and in the United States government. So I'll leave it there. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. And now we're going to go to you, Dr. Connolly. Can you bring us into this conversation and particularly focus on how other governments and international organizations attempt to learn? Are there any lessons that we could borrow here at the State Department from other institutions, particularly maybe UN or EU or other partner governments?
Sure. Well, thank you, Dr. Rand, and also to my panelists. And in answering your question, I have to begin by commending the State Department for following through on the 2018 Evidence Act with this learning agenda, because it's quite new internationally, especially at the foreign policy level. I think it's fair to say that, in answer to your question, internationally, where we have seen the greatest development in this area is in the international development, which of course links very closely to the foreign policy and often overlaps. And there, what we have seen is several EU states bilaterally, to begin with, have invested from the start in rigorous evidence and research. Of course, the US government is doing this as well, but fair to say, the United Kingdom Department of International Development has been singled out several times up until 2015 for the amount of funding it invested in rigorous evidence and research. And the point there is that if you don't invest in that evidence, then it's very, very difficult to learn. But this is quite new. And in fact, I think one of the main challenges is, and just listening to my panelists, is, what do we mean by learning? Of course, we're all learners, and several panelists here are teaching at the top universities in the world, but what does it mean to be a learning organization? And some would be quite skeptical of that. Some would say from the get-go that organizations can't learn; it's people that learn. So how do you do it collectively is the real challenge. And to give you some examples to your questions, Dr. Rand, I mentioned the United Kingdom. I take some other examples. The Netherlands, for example, and Sweden have been using the mechanism of help desks, linking with universities typically or research experts, and trying to bring the evidence and the research to the policymakers as quickly as possible on very technical topics, not very abstract, but actually getting the evidence right into the learning and the decision making. And there has been lessons on that. For example, the Netherlands for many years had a series of knowledge platforms on areas such as security and rule of law and food security, and have reflected that one of the main advantages of a knowledge platform, typically done with universities, but also private sector, is it enables a multi-stakeholder approach. And if you're trying to resolve wicked problems and difficult, complex policy issues, you really need to work together and collaborate and bring together different perspectives in order to have any chance of finding solutions. You asked about multilaterally. The EU, for example, has just recently, I think this year, brought out a kind of a competency framework, recognizing, and I think this is an important part for our discussion, that in understanding the relationship between evidence, learning, and decision making in foreign policy and diplomacy, it's not just about State Departments. You also need to look at the competencies of those who are producing the evidence. As I said, typically universities, researchers. Something we do very much here at the United States Institute of Peace with our fellows program is working with some of the top fellows in the US, peace scholars, in supporting them, encouraging them to take their excellent research projects, but trying to make it relevant for policymakers. It's extremely difficult. And of course, colleagues here are very much involved in that. Some other lessons from the experiences internationally is, of course, you need to have clear policy goals. I appreciate, Ambassador Bodine said that sometimes that's not possible, but sometimes it is. And I'm sure we'll get to that later in the discussion. You can have clear policy goals, and that enables you then to track and to measure. Another lesson would be you need a system, not very exciting, but you need a system to manage and share knowledge. And of course, US government agencies have been very active on this, but it's difficult. It takes a lot of resources and a lot of commitment to it. Something that Eric mentioned, crucial is you need that buy-in, that support from leadership. This is another lesson. Where you have that support for learning, as we can see in this State Department learning agenda, by leadership, you really do increase the chances of success. It's not just about leadership. It's about also, and this is extremely difficult, almost taboo, how do you recognize failure in a bureaucracy? How do you enable colleagues who are doing wonderful jobs day to day, but at the same time, we're all human, we all make mistakes, and how do you enable that sharing of failure and learning through failure, not just the success, but the failures? And I think every foreign policy unit and government and organizations have really struggled with that. It's something interesting. The private sector seems, I'm generalizing here, private sector has greater success in celebrating failure as a way to learn. And then my last point, or last lesson, is that how do you close the gaps then between not just evidence and decision making, but also evidence learning and then decision making? And what, there's a little bit of literature on this, a little bit of evidence on the evidence that shows that, in bureaucracies, in government, the type of learning, type of evidence that is most respected is when it is driven internally. But of course, that can be very difficult. And that's why we've typically seen evidence and learning sort of contracted out or done through partnerships. So one lesson from, if we look internationally, is, how do you close that gap, which is also about trust between generating the evidence and the learning, and then where does it land within government? And my last point here is what we have seen, if we look elsewhere, is the vital role of trusted conveners. So they're not necessarily the ones generating the research, but they're kind of in between think tanks, other type of organizations that are trusted by government and also understand research. And this has kind of been a missing piece so far. And it could explain why we haven't seen so much success in terms of learning and foreign policy. The very important role of that trusted convener, that policy, that knowledge broker, which can bring together the government, the foreign policy experts, and those who are producing the knowledge to try and ensure that learning takes place and that it is sustainable.
Thank you so much, Dr. Connolly. For the sake of time and given how many people in our audience want to ask questions, I think we're going to shrink the second and third round into just one final round of questions from me, and then we'll turn to some questions from our Q&A because we have a huge audience here today. So, Ambassador Bodine, maybe I could just ask you to give one example of a diplomatic approach that has changed and improved based on learning that you've seen in your time. And then maybe one also example of a foreign assistance, that has been used strategically and where it's worked really successfully. You've mentioned a few from your career, but maybe you could just share a few other examples where both U.S. diplomatic and foreign assistance approaches have really benefited from learning and have been successful.
Unfortunately, there's more examples of where we didn't learn, at least on major policy. And one example on that was before we went into Libya. I think it was NDU organized a roundtable, did the convening, brought in experts from Afghanistan and Iraq and Kosovo and ever onward to try to get lessons learned before we went into Libya. And I was in there. all the right things were said, all the right lessons were tabled, all the right discussion was had. And as soon as we went into Libya, it was like the meeting never happened. And I think the one point of that is that trying to make the learning, the knowledge retention and conveyance of knowledge and wisdom into set pieces, into something that is convened with the proper people to talk about the specific issue is useful, but not at all sufficient. The kind of learning that I found useful and that I tried to do in my career is the day-to-day. When I first joined the Middle East Bureau, to be perfectly honest, I had never met an Arab, which I told them when they recruited me. I had a boss who, and this goes to the time issue, Eric, who after work, we would sit down in his office and he would share the backstory of everything I was working on. And so what you had was this generational transfer of experience, this generational transfer of the context, the stories that you needed to have, not just because they were fun stories, but because they informed what I was looking at that day. He could take it back 20 years, and he was often taking it back a generation that had spent the time. And so I think there needs to be a different idea about what this training and knowledge conveyance is. With all due respect to the military, the training is very, you will go over there, you will be trained, and then you will come out and we will do something else with you. It's great, but that's not how you really learn how to be a good military officer. It's not how you learn how to be a good diplomat. And I agree that there has to be time made, priority given, value seen in senior officers and mid-level officers doing the oral history. That's where you learn these kinds of things, not in set pieces, with all due respect. And I was the Dean of Professional Studies at FSI. So I can talk about FSI and what it can't do. It's not sufficient. The lessons, I think one of the things that we did, one thing that we did not learn, and this is on your foreign assistance side, is again, the power of the soft skill relationship. The most impactful, God, I hate that word. I can't believe I just used it. The most effective thing I have seen us do abroad have always been scholarships and exchange programs. They are almost impossible to measure the impact unless you go retrospective. If I give a scholarship to somebody, I'm not going to know in 5 years what it means, or even 10 years, maybe not even 15, but it's there. And so we need to invest in our people learning, but then we need to also look on that side. Examples where we hopefully need to change, and this goes back to an earlier conversation about Kosovo, it goes into Iraq, it goes into Afghanistan, it goes into almost all the major mistakes we've made, is we don't put a value on understanding the other side. Yes, we do need clear policy goals. And I'm sorry, David, if it sounded like I said there was no such thing as clear policy goals. There have to be clear policy goals. If you don't know where you're trying to get, you have no idea how to get there. The problem is the metrics en route. We know we need to develop a strong civil society in Yemen, but how do you do that? How you define that? That's where it gets harder to quantify en route to that very clear policy goal, and there has to be more adaptation. The one other thing I have, and again, the military is I was going to say notorious, is well regarded for lessons learned, but they also have a problem that many of them will admit, that they tend to fight the last war. And so how do you learn lessons adaptive to go forward, as opposed to becoming a set piece to replicate until it's quite clear that it doesn't replicate, because it never replicates. So the lessons learned, again, like becoming too focused on data points, can actually distort your ability to develop knowledge, lessons, adaptation to go forward.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Okay, so we're going to turn to you, Eric. That's a good segue. And we really want to push you on security sector assistance. As everyone knows, the State Department has now received an extraordinarily generous appropriation from Congress to support the Ukrainian army and military fighting. We have an unprecedented level of security sector assistance in this building now that F and the Political Military Bureau are overseeing. This issue of how we train and how we use our security sector assistance is obviously both a DoD and state issue, but here at the State Department, what have we learned on this foreign assistance issue? How do we successfully shore up our partners' military capacity? And are there lessons from Iraq and Afghanistan and other recent efforts that we should be thinking about right now as we manage this massive security sector assistance objective here at the State Department?
Sure. Yeah, this is a super important issue right now, given what's going on. So my perspective is that the most important thing that people who are working on security sector assistance could learn is to improve how to execute on the resources that you already have, and make sure that you get things through the pipeline to the parties that need them. The Ukrainians need a lot of help. There are a lot of resources right now. From my perspective, spending quite a lot of time in and out of Baghdad and Kabul and seeing the way the State Department and the Department of Defense would work, it most often is an execution problem, not an identifying the problem issue or an analytic problem. Here's where the government has been bad, but in the foreign policy establishment to begin with, at fancy schools like the Kennedy School and Georgetown, you can probably take 15 classes on foreign policy making, write a good options memo, do policy analysis, maybe never take a class on how to get things done, how to put together a Gantt chart, how to do backward planning, how to measure things and outcomes. In this way, I'll most respectfully disagree with Ambassador Bodine. I think looking at the data matters a lot. I think measuring outcomes matter a lot in the specific area of security cooperation and assistance, because you need to be able to track how you're doing and set up a process where a leader around the table can hold people accountable for not delivering results. And part of that is the learning that is involved with even the technical skills of something like project management. I think Ambassador Bodine had an excellent point about too often people fighting the last war. That's definitely a problem for the military and DoD. I would say also, the entire foreign policy establishment needs to be careful not to make false analogies about more future-looking issues. Here's an example. I've spent a lot of time in and around the cyber domain. Almost always, people would say, this is just like nuclear nonproliferation. We need to come to a norms agreement with the Russians, and if we have rules of the road, it'll all work out. It's not like that. So you have to be careful about applying past lessons to future issues that have a totally different problem set. Think about outer space right now. It's going to be different than the things in the past, than the wars in the past too. So part of the learning is learning new issues and thinking about how to apply new concepts to them, not just looking back, I think, anyway, which I think is exactly along the lines of what Ambassador Bodine was saying.
Great, thanks so much, Eric. And so, David, just if you could stay on this topic of assistance, we have much more foreign assistance in now at the State Department than we've had in the past. Because of COVID, because of the Ukraine supplementals, we have a lot of foreign assistance, and part of this learning agenda will try to strive to help us evaluate how we are using it to achieve not project level outcomes, but really institutional level strategic outcomes in line with the State Department's mission on economic growth, prosperity, governance, democracy, security, stability, and national interests. How can we think through our assistance evaluations to make them more strategic and really to tell us if the taxpayer dollars are achieving these bigger foreign policy goals?
Thanks. Well, the bad news is strategy evaluation, I would argue, is probably the most difficult because of the complexities involved, because of the many excellent points that my panelists have been making in today's session. But not to give up hope completely. There are good examples, including here at USIP, where, of course, at a smaller scale, I admit, but nonetheless, we are trying to measure long-term strategy. I think another good example is the Global Fragility Act, taking that 10-year horizon. And it's very bold, it's very difficult. There will be failure, going back to my previous point, but are we able to recognize that failure? Are we building that culture, that trust, where we can own it and then learn from it? That remains to be seen. But back to your question, be as clear as you can about your intended outcomes. That may seem terribly obvious, but is difficult, especially when you're working in complexity. Other questions are, what is your strategy, and how do you plan for your projects or your activities to then support that strategy? Often we find gaps in that very basic approach. We think about theory of change typically at a project level, and this can be a bit of a turnoff for people as well, theory of change, but it has proven to be a very effective way to understand the types of policy change and policy influence that we're trying to undertake. So what is your theory of change at that strategic level? And then to ask yourself, what is the most appropriate way to measure the change? I want to pick up on a point from earlier, which, I agree, too much of evidence has been synonymous with quantitative data. I think we all know that, and we've seen it. And of course, that's been a hindrance in the whole evidence and learning debate. What type of evidence is most appropriate? We've just finished a commission paper here at the Institute, which looks at that question: what constitutes effective evidence in ... Because it's not all the same, and you have to have that nuanced, granular, open-minded approach. You can look at hierarchies of evidence, fine, but you have to be inclusive when it comes to evidence, both the qualitative and the quantitative, and ultimately taking that sort of mixed methods approach. And I would say, back to your question, Dr. Rand, strategy, complex, long-term, the secret really is in the monitoring. I know this has been mentioned before, but yet we find time after time, it's the part that's left out. We're too much focused on the evaluation, understanding the impact, the outcomes, but actually we got to pull back, and we got to make it not as exciting, I admit, but you got to have your monitoring systems, your data collection in place. And of course, you need to have the resources, of course, to do that. And that's really in the secret. One of the things, again, at the Institute, we work at a different scale, of course, from state, but nonetheless, there is an equivalence there, because many colleagues here are involved in that complex, how do you inform and improve policy? Of course, working with USG. One of the things that we just developed in the last few years with colleagues is we call it a policy tracker. It's almost like a diary. I realize some people don't like to do diaries, but some do. But it's very simple tool, monitoring tool. And even if you're in a situation where you're not quite sure where your outcomes are, that's fine. But nonetheless, you're keeping track of that, and you're understanding how you get not just from A to Z, but all the different points in between. Because as colleagues mentioned, this work is ultimately about building good relationships. We know relationships matter, but we're less clear on in what ways do they matter, and why is one relationship gone very well in one case, but not in the other. I don't think yet we have that in terms of rigor and be able to share that level of knowledge. And I hope that's definitely something when I read the strategy, the learning agenda, I hope that we can get to that level. And just a couple of more points, if I may, in answer to your question. What types of change do you want to measure? Again, basic question, but sometimes we skip over it. Is it behavioral, attitudinal? Is it procedure? Often, diplomacy, as I mentioned, but relationships is a process, but typically we don't have the time to understand how that process works and our role in that process. And then my last point is, how do you do that without having millions of dollars? You got to build in very quick learning moments. Here at the Institute, it's not our idea. We stole it from NASA, actually, but we try to incorporate pause and learns. Very quick, informal my team can facilitate it, or the programmatic teams can do it, just reflecting in a very sort of safe space, what has gone well, what has worked, what hasn't, etc. And it doesn't take a ton of time, but nonetheless, you're building that culture, that sort of practice, and it has proven to be very effective. So building that in, building a culture of testing and experimenting quickly, learning in real time, that is what I would say in answer to your question. You know, how do you measure that long-term sort of complex policy? It's actually about the here and now, and not getting too caught up in the long term. And of course, being able to adapt. We've mentioned that word before. It's really important. You know, how do you adapt then within your 10-year or your 5-year horizon? That really is crucial.
Thank you so much. And I hope that all the State Department employees who are on and listening are really inspired by the fact that so many of our panelists have really focused on the execution today, on stuff that might not be as sexy as preparing a memo for the Secretary of State, but really is critical to getting our work right. So thank you. We didn't even stage this, but you really inspired us, all of you, particularly the State Department employees who are listening. Now we're going to turn it over to Q&A, and I'm going to turn it over to Erica from the Belfer Center to moderate the Q&A. I also want to thank, I know we have a number of former ambassadors, retired ambassadors joining us. So I just want to thank many of the esteemed guests here for their interest and participation, and welcome them to contact us to help. We need all the help we can get from those who've retired from the Foreign Service and retired from the Civil Service here at the State Department. So just a plug to reach out to us here to help us after this event. Over to you, Erica.
Thank you, Director Rand. We have a lot of questions from a very full audience today. So hopefully we can start with maybe 2 and see where things go. So we'll start with a question from Felix Burgle. He asks, having a formal learning agenda seems to me a very commendable, useful, and forward-looking initiative. How sustainable is such an initiative in today's paralyzing polarization? That's the first question. And the second is from an HKS student, Ilya Timchenko. It's specifically for Ambassador Bodine, but maybe the others will have something to say. So the question is, being historically attuned should be a given, but how much does cultural awareness play within diplomatic wisdom? Furthermore, does it make sense to have diplomats that specialize on a region or country, or is there more value being a generalist who is more internationally flexible? So I'll leave those on the table. Maybe Ambassador Bodine, you can take that, that second one.
I do think that diplomats are better when they have had the opportunity to work within a region or work within a broad set of issues. You're developing the experience and the expertise and a little bit of the depth. If you were to take me and drop me in Bolivia, could I do my job? Yes, I think I probably could, but there would be a learning curve there. That would be a significant loss of time. And so, yes, having a specialty is good. Now, having said that, you can also be way too narrow, and you can see the world solely through the prism of the one piece that you have spent your entire life working on. And sometimes getting out of your region and understanding either similar issues, similar situations, and how they're dealt with differently. I spent most of my career on the Arabian Peninsula. At one point, I was pulled off to be the director of East Africa, an area I knew nothing about. It actually was extremely useful for me to bring my NEA background to the Horn of Africa, Red Sea countries. And that in turn played back when I went to Yemen as ambassador and further assignments. So they actually made me a broader and better officer. I think what's important is not how much time you spend in one region, although I lean toward having a major but some strong minors. But have you developed the ability to delve into the culture and the history, the narratives, the identities, the experiences of where you are. If you come in and think that your job is to convey US policy, US interests, US programs, and how the US thinks things ought to be, I don't care how much background you have in that region, you're going to be a failure. One thing I was told early on in my career is that you get paid as much to listen as to talk. And sometimes I think that should be up there someplace, where everyone can see it. If you have learned how to listen, if you have learned how to understand context and narrative and what you're doing, then you can move and probably should move to other parts of the world to keep a perspective on it. If you are going to be delivering démarches on what the US wants, you're not going to be any good anyway. So I'm more interested in the kind of thought process an officer brings to the table than whether or not they've served in the region. And I will often tell my students, I think much to their chagrin, is that I really want to know if you know the questions to ask when you're confronted with an issue or you're confronted with a problem. Don't tell me what the answers are. Tell me what questions you're asking. So that would be my answer on that.
Wonderful. Eric, is there anything you'd add?
Actually, I think that was super well covered. So I'll
Okay.
pass the baton.
That's to me. I mean, I just absolutely want to agree. The focus on competencies and understanding better, what are the key competencies, is I think also has been, deserve much more attention. Of course, the contextual knowledge is crucial, but it's fair to say that the broader competencies, the listening, has been overlooked. But I think we are, as I mentioned earlier, with the EU is just one example, but there's others where we are seeing a return to, asking what are the key competencies that are needed, and how can we best serve those and enable those competencies.
We had a question on polarization. Would any of you like to take that one?
Polarization is bad.
Eric?
And Eric, you can do the long version.
Sure. And I think mine, in short, is not any different than Ambassador Bodine. But I would just say this, I'm a little dismayed at that question, actually, because y'all, political polarization is bad. It's really bad right now, but there have been other eras when it was also terrible. And if any of the people who are on this call are doing this work can't set aside time to do learning because of political polarization, then that's a huge mistake. Here's an example right now. For the first time in a few decades, members of the intelligence community came to the Kennedy School. They're here for the whole week. For the first time, they're out of their normal jobs to do some learning. They're also in the middle of a lot of political battles, like the IC often is. You can't let that stuff distract you, right? You got to keep your focus on your job, make some time to learn, keep getting better. And the only other thing I would say is I do think it's really important, and something that unfortunately I think the State Department is not resourced for, not that it would not want to do, to have time to go out of your normal career for a year or so every several years to retool, reinvent yourself, do some thinking. And that's something where, hopefully if state could get a little bit more in their budget, have more personnel, you could build that in on a way.
Let me just add that as somebody who is at state, yes, we would love to be able to encourage more people to take a year for either study or to work in the private sector. But we are not even funded at full staffing needs. And in order to do that kind of breaks you need what's called a training float. And until or unless Congress gives us sufficient, credible, and consistent money for a training float, we will always want to do that, and we will have very limited opportunities.
So relatedly, we just had a question from an anonymous attendee. I've appreciated the panel's comments on integrating more learning, iteration, and adaptation into the foreign policy process and to focus on outcomes. I think one major issue is that the time horizons of impact measurement don't really align with congressional funding cycle and the speed at which funds go into the field. How can the department demonstrate that an intended outcome 20 years down the road is something that should be invested in every year?
I can try to answer that a little bit with a story, because diplomats always answer everything with a story or an analogy. When I was in Yemen and I wanted to get the Fulbright scholarships started again, and I think it was one of the best things that we ever did in Yemen. And I was asked, how was I going to measure, the impact, all those kinds of questions. And I firmly believe that scholarships are good, but it takes you at least 10 years to find out if you put it in the right place. So what I did is I had a very talented summer intern, and I said, your job is to interview all of the US scholarship recipients who are currently in the government, media, civil society, academia, whatever, and basically build an oral history from them on how their time as a student in the US shaped them, but also shaped their views on governance, on all of the soft issues that we say we're trying to promote in order to advance our security. And he did a masterful job because it really demonstrated to the folks in Washington what the 5, 10, 20-year impact of scholarships would be on the development of Yemen and on Yemeni-American relations and our ability to work together, not just on security, for God's sake, but on governance and on women's issues and education and health and the full broad range of things. And it was such a good paper that we were able to get the Fulbright scholarships started. So sometimes when you're being asked to demonstrate what a 20-year impact would be, you can't do that prospectively. It's impossible. But you can go back and do a retrospective and talk to the people who got training a year ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and build it that way. And that's how you can answer that question as to why it needs to be a long-term program.
Dr. Connolly, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, a lot. I realize our time is short, though. Well, first of all, I completely agree. My previous life as an academic, I had the real privilege to work with scholars from Afghanistan and Iraq, to name but a few. And I agree. You immediately you understand the scholarship at that individual level, and there's no doubt it can be such a powerful catalyst for anyone, especially someone who is coming out of war or who is still caught in the middle of war. There's no doubt. And I think we've lots of examples where, if you think about impact, and Afghanistan, is one example, where, after the 1990s into the 2000s, where we were seeing, of course, relative to the difficult context, where we were seeing some changes there in terms of governance and development. I mean, interestingly, if you look to who was driving that in terms of the Afghan government, were those who had the benefit of scholarships either in the UK and the US. Now, I realize that could start a whole other discussion, but there is evidence to show that broader impact. In particular, someone who has had a year out on a scholarship, let's say, and then goes back to the context with a very different mindset. And one, of course, is to be reform-minded, is one example. So I think individual level, there's no doubt. I think we do need much more. I think we could look back, whether it's examples of Yemen, Afghanistan, and Iraq. I mean, US, UK, others have been running scholarships for decades, and it'd be interesting to see that sort of broader impact and the real change that these scholarships are enabling at that, you know, societal and state level.
This is Doug Picken with also the Bureau of Budget and Planning. I do want to reflect on something that Ambassador Bodine said, that as part of the department's modernization agenda, this actually commitment to better developing our professional development and training opportunities is among our signature initiatives. We've actually started this year. We expanded the float by about 80, sort of carving that out of resources, but our request to Congress for 2023 actually proposes to grow up by about 20%, adding 250 additional positions for longer term professional development and training. You know, some mix of FSI training for hard languages, particularly things like Chinese and Arabic, which require years to master, but also more opportunities outside the department with academic institutions, with NGOs, with the private sector, really reacting to that demand signal, which we've heard from many stakeholders, but also many of our internal staff. And that will, of course, be coupled with investments in FSI to better develop internal training opportunities on things like climate and emerging technology. So it is something where, with all the resource constraints you acknowledged, and the many demands upon our time, the domestic policy discussions that go on every day, the demands from overseas to have more bench strength at our posts, this commitment to professional development is one of the highest priorities for the Secretary, Deputy Secretary McCune, and we were really trying to commit resources to make that more real and balance against all the other priorities we have.
Good.
So I think we have out of time and we're going to have to close the session. I just want to thank all of our folks who have questions, and I know there's a lot of richness in the questions that you still have. So maybe we can figure out a way that you can email them to the State Department and or the Belfer Center so we can continue this conversation. And because this is just the launch, this is just the start. I think I mentioned, but this is a 4-year project. So we've told the White House and Congress that we will be doing these learning activities over the next 4 years up until 2026. And that aligns nicely with our joint State Department USAID strategic plan. So we hope that the energy and excitement that you all have, and hopefully we've inspired a little bit, even more of it, will continue, and that you can channel your questions and your ideas back to us. I'd like to turn over the mic to Doug Picken, who has been the partner for the Office of Foreign Assistance on this, and who manages the other half of the budget for the State Department, probably the part that when you're in the field and you're here in Washington matters so much every day, which is, you know, who do I have? What are my resources for my people? Which is just as critical, obviously, as the foreign assistance piece to this. Over to you, Doug.
Thank you. So, of course, I do want to start by thanking all of our panelists, Ambassador Bodine, David Connolly, Eric Rosenbach, for their participation and expert perspective on these issues. Of course, Daphne and her team for all the work setting this up. Ambassador Undersecretary Nuland for her contribution. That's all I think shows the importance in which the department is attaching to these issues and trying to learn and build more of a culture of learning and evaluation and data, but also the qualitative side, as you mentioned as well. And that will help all of our bureaus better implement strategies, carry out policy. It'll help our workforce better manage programs and build relationships. And also, as we look at our post-daily engagement with their host partners, how they actually build and strengthen those relationships, whether bilateral or multilateral. I also want to thank all of our Learning Agenda team, and we've put the team leads here. Certainly, I want to thank also the team leads, Pamela and Liz Vega from F, as well as Stephanie Cabell, who've been working on these issues for years. And many of their, of course, their leadership we've reflected there, but we have actually question leads on each of these, each of the 8 questions. We've covered 2 of them here. Some of the other questions we're tackling address how we better manage risk and how we address risk agility and leadership, particularly learning the lessons from a post like Libya. As much as the painful those lessons from Benghazi were, we can't let that stop us from going out and engaging with the Eastern Caribbean, the oceans of the Pacific Islands, where, like the Solomons, we're facing an ever more aggressive, assertive China presence. How do we make sure that we have people in the field that are risk safe, risk sensitive, that we can get there without a 5 or 10 year embassy construction timeline? How do we better address crises such as the pandemic or climate, which of course are 2 of the most major issues that we're facing that are both an ongoing blocking and tackling for how we implement programs, but how do we make sure we're addressing the right problems and making smart choices about which issues we're facing? We mentioned the Consular Services. As much as it is sort of a processing exercise, it is our most public-facing element. Many ways that most Americans and many members of the foreign public meet the Department of State is part of our consular operations. And so it's both a service we provide to the American public, a service we provide to foreign nationals. And so we're mindful of how do we make sure that experience is both smooth, efficient, but also protects our national security interests, which is in partnership with DHS. Countering disinformation, we didn't really touch on it, but that's obviously a clearly department mission through the Global Engagement Center, and has the GEC work across the interagency to better identify strategies to counter disinformation, which in the last 2 or 3 years particularly has really crystallized as one of the major challenges we face in articulating our foreign policy vision abroad. And certainly, how do we make sure that we're giving our diplomats the tools to counter the adverse narratives that they face in many of the countries and partners they engage with? And then sort of as a holistic, how do we integrate data and operational information to help improve policy decision-making, recognizing the power of data, of sharing data to help understand these issues, but also the limitations that we have to still have cultural awareness and a knowledge of our history and a knowledge of how organizations and our host nations work in order to make the data-informed decisions relevant. So I just want to thank, again, everybody, and this has really been, I think, a very useful start for this process. We certainly mentioned the learning agenda as really what brought us here, but it has brought together a number of threads that were going on within the department, across academia, across the interagency. And so we want to thank everyone for all their engagement today and look forward to further dialogue and support, because we know that this is a field where we have a rich field of stakeholders who are eager to bring their perspectives to help the department and better achieve its mission. So thank you.